Hello, my name's Lauren. I'm streaming today from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and I'd also like to pay my respects to the Indigenous people who are the owners of the land in which a lot of our servers are based, so that we can interface in this way during a pandemic. My name's Lauren. You can also call me Jem when we're online. I answer to both. I'm a digital media student at RMIT. I really like making music and playing with poetry and doing coding stuff. And I'm always up for a chat about anything in between those subjects. Today I'm going to be talking about my hyperlink poem. First, in this presentation, I will do a reading of the poem, a kind of performance or reading of the poem, and then after that I'll talk a little bit about what's under the hood conceptually and talk about my process and ideas. Thank you. Press your paw here. We press pause to press play. When a spark goes online, there is great joy. But when one is extinguished, the universe weeps. The thinnest, bluest line underscores each string. A phantom meniscus. And once we hit those blue lines, hold and linger in red. Release. And finally, the meniscus bruises purple. Which modes, which impulses are prioritized over the other? And who has become othered? Who is responsible for notions of beasts? Spotted and striped fur, cloaking a body pumped with mech fluid. Where web-breathed arachnoids threaten to feast upon those fluids. Predator and prey dance together over and over again. Passing code and passing forks. It's an old story. Maybe someday we'll learn. Taking bites out of mechanoid shells. Violence begets violence. Beast odes and beast code. Return to base. So for me, hyperlink poetry, hyperlink choreography, it's got such a vivid lineage in net art, and it's been pretty instrumental for me to access a kind of inner CPU for exploring ideas. So using hyperlink poetry to as a carrier for ideas, and it's been a pretty necessary part of my process to create prose from inklings and identifying patterns and binaries scoped out in critical post-humanities, which is sort of the framework that I'm looking at. So my poem is actually an ode to a TV show called Beast Wars. It ran from 1996 to 99, and it was an animated TV show that centered around these beast machines, and I'll get more into that in a moment. So in coding, or using code, we set rules and we declare variables, and rules can function in this way where it's there to avoid any sort of chaos, right? But the opposite can happen, where if there are no rules and we have only chaos, even chaos or randomness is sort of mediated or pre-mediated or determined in the browser. So you have to be quite deliberate to be creating randomness or chaos, and at what point is it really randomness and it sort of becomes homogeneous again. And I think that there is that tension in code poetry, and you can sort of play with the choreography to give the impression that you are guiding a viewer, or a viewer is taking themselves through a garden of many walking paths. But you can play with the almost physicality of the browser, the actions that we enact in the browser to tell a story or create an experience. So Doll Space by Francesca Di Rimini, aka Doll Yoko, is a hyperlink poem, but it's not just about clicking links and moving through a space. It's also about hovering over the screen and trying to locate places where you can click through to the next string in the poem or the next line. So it begins from a poem and kind of turns into an installation with images and multiple links leading you to lots of different areas of a poem or a story. And it's not just text. She's also using imagery to kind of bolster, tantalize, evoke, not just with found imagery, but also with imagery of letters and emails and correspondence. So there's stories within stories, and it's quite an effective way of creating an experience. And it's very deliberate, and it kind of adds to this, really rich tapestry within the story that she's telling. So I was drawn to this show, Beast Wars. So my poem is definitely a love letter to Beast Wars, and that's sort of how it came about. But I was finding that it was resonating with a lot of the conceptual frameworks that I was looking at. I'd sort of refer to it as, observing a TV show that I'm into in a kind of nostalgic way, but also with these lenses to look through it. But for me, it's kind of more than that. It's not just applying a lens or a framework for the sake of it. It's kind of, having an inkling and then drawing out that inkling and maybe being a bit speculative about that inkling being the meaning of the piece. So it's not just an ode, love letter to the TV show. It's not just a love letter to hyperlink poetry. It's also about meaning making and exploring that. So it's also about, I mentioned critical post-humanities and talking about Haraway and writers like that talk about nature being not separate from us as humans, but Haraway also talking about cybernetics and cyborgs being a combination of animal and machine. So there's sort of these binaries that are scoped out in her speculative meaning making, and for me the content of Beast Wars is dealing with binaries, sometimes binaries within binaries, and the most immediate binary explored is that of beast and machine. And within that binary is impulse and system. So we could think of impulse as as animal. So the beast shell wrapping the robot form embedded within has these animal impulses, but also system as being machine. So the robot within the beast shell. So these characters in the show, they've crash landed on a planet and they scan the area for life forms, and they use the DNA, they copy the DNA of the life forms to create and produce an organic shell to cloak their inner robot forms. So each character is expressing both animal and machine, therefore system and impulse, as a kind of continuous loop, like a circuit. So there's this Harawayan reading of it as nature and machine, or nature and technology as not being separate or somehow at a distance. And therefore, nature and technology is not, they're not binary opposites. They are in fact continuous and related. So these characters are piloted by their spark. In the show, the lore of the show, the spark is akin to soul or spirit. So the sort of humanity within the beast machine. And the spark, it's also linked to the idea of a script or a program that informs personality traits, behaviors, desire, affect. It also dictates whether they are a part of the good faction or the bad faction, because the TV show follows the conflicts of two warring factions. So the idea that they each have some sort of unique soul or spark within is something I'm also quite drawn to.
What's new, Pussycat?
Rhinox, what's going on? A spark!
Yup. The very thing which makes us what we are. Every Cybertron, Maximal, or Predacon has one, and each is different. When a spark goes online, there's great joy. When one's extinguished, the universe weeps.
So I find these storylines or laws very seductive, and I've used direct quotes from the dialogue in the TV show that I found particularly resonant or interesting. So I've mentioned that beast and machine are this continuous loop, but there are consequences for being in robot or machine mode too long. So within a few minutes of combat or what have you, in robot form, their circuits are susceptible to a kind of system corruption due to the potency of a substance, a material called energon on the planet that they find themselves on. So an excess of energon is a poison, and on the planet that they find themselves on, energon is all over the planet. It's raw, it's unstable, it's almost impossible to use as a fuel source because it is so unstable, and they're not really able to harness the power of it or distill it into some form that is usable for them. However, a lot of the conflict between the two factions is around this really powerful energy source, but neither can really access or use it. So beast mode represents a kind of neutral form where you are not susceptible to the poison, and it means that your circuits will fry unless you adopt some sort of neutral form. And the poison itself also poses a risk of what's called a stasis lock, where the beast machines would be frozen in just robot mode and just rot, essentially, just fry. And if they're not able to transform back into beast mode in time, and therefore completing that circuit, they're not able to move between those two interchangeable forms. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to probe or speculate what that could mean. And for me, it's almost like a speculative fantasy of what if nature and machine was this closed circuit, and how can it be embodied? And for me, the show sort of fantasizes about that quite directly or indirectly, depending on your reading of it. The robot forms are, recognizably humanoid, and they're anthropomorphic. All the characters are anthropomorphic in their speech and their idiosyncrasies, and their beast impulses sort of, at first, early in the series, their impulses only really make their way into their dialogue, and mostly through, just bearable one-liners and puns and stuff, or voice actors imitating animal sounds. However, it's revealed that there are consequences to being in beast mode for too long. So in an episode where the Maximals, the goodies, are all terribly sleep deprived, they're guarding their ship because the Predacons, the baddies, have stolen a key piece of equipment that shields their base, their ship, from absorbing energon interference. So it protects them from the poison. But without this key piece of tech, they're vulnerable to the poison. So they have to be in beast form. And they sort of begrudge this at first, and one character begrudges saying something like, "Oh, you mean I have to wear this fur coat all the time?" So there's this sort of awareness of like the shell being, "Oh, this is just a shell to protect me." So this character in a way is really separating those two forms. It's like, no, I'm this and this is just a shell. But eventually these animal impulses take over because they've been in beast mode too long, and they forget who they are. They forget that they're a machine within, and they run out of the base and leave their posts, and the baddies in robot form make a kind of sport of hunting them. So they're sort of reenacting this hunter and animal fantasy as well. And one of the characters, who's a cybernetic tiger. Having spent more time in beast mode than the rest of them, he eventually teaches his comrades to kind of let the beast instincts help them, and he encourages them to embody both. And he sort of gives them, I don't know, tries to communicate with them non-verbally, and all of a sudden instructs them to kind of visualize their internal programming and visualize the piece of code that is telling you to behave in this certain way and shut it down. So there's almost this weird like visualization and meditation kind of suggestion in what he's saying, and they all are able to visualize and kind of revert back to the mode where they are in a beast form, but very much aware of the fact that they are a robot within, and then they're able to switch between the modes once again. So there's this feeling of circuitry being overridden, susceptible, but also closed continuous loops of nature and tech, which I find quite seductive, as I've said. So hyperlinks, which is the sort of medium I'm working with, hyperlinks are ubiquitously blue, and they turn red once you hit them, and then afterwards they become purple. And for me, that evoked a kind of violence within the browser. A blue link turns bloody red and then bruises purple. So there's this kind of conceptual connection with violence. So that's just one reading. There's also a conceptual connection between the blue lines of hyperlinks and also the blue lines of a police force. And in the poem, I imagined this thin blue line to be a phantom or somehow imaginary. I also imagined it to have a permeable surface, like a cell membrane where information can pass through on either side, but also something like the permeable line of a meniscus on top of a glass of water. So this thin blue line, this police force, reinforces this binary of good and bad, and Sylvia Wynter describes the thin blue line as best understood as a defense of a particular genre of the human or man that overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself. But importantly, thin blue line articulates this police project of inventing the human as always incomplete, insecure, and unstable. Of course, it must always be incomplete because it is through its inability to fully eradicate the bestial trace that police claim a license to endless war in the name of humanity. So we see how the police force reinforces and justifies a type of othering, and often othering marginalized peoples, and there is this sort of violence. Seemingly disparate connections, but I think this is also part of my process, which is adding inputs and threads and lenses and trying to explore meaning making. There's an episode of Beast Wars where this Tigatron acknowledges the settler or colonizer or invader within him. So his faction, the rival faction, they've both crash landed on this planet that is a perceived void. It doesn't appear to have anyone on it, no humans or robots or otherwise, just animals. So there's also no police, so there's no mediating forces. So these characters, to me, are playing out these fantasies or just playing out these things that they're completely unmediated by what we might understand to be the big other. Well, at least maybe not. There might be the big other there. It's just not something that they can see or feel. So there's also a kind of sense of a hauntological aspect to this show, which is this speculative future, but also this sort of mourning of a lost future. And this happens in an episode where a flying island is discovered, so a void within a void, and it also seems to have nothing on it. But if you transform into robot form while you're there and you use a weapon, the island is booby-trapped and will set off explosions and traps as a kind of warning against further violence. So one reading could be that this island is a kind of inverse of a police state. There is no police state, but there is some sort of violence mediating things. But also, definitely a sense of some kind of future lost or mourning of a future that hasn't happened yet, which is Mark Fisher has talked about that in Ghosts of My Life. And I'll show you this clip to illustrate what I mean.
Whoa! What do you suppose that beam was all about?
Some kind of signal?
A message. We were given a paradise. All we had to do was live there in peace. But we proved unworthy. And the paradise is no more.
Yeah. It's an old story. Maybe someday we'll learn.
Yeah, well, pardon my pragmatism here in this, deeply philosophical moment, but I'm a little more concerned about who got that message. Because you gotta know, they ain't gonna be real happy.
What do you think they're gonna do?
That? We're just going to have to wait and see.
So how are all of these things connected? So while I'm scoping out a practice, I'm taking a lot of aimless wandering, and I'm trying to make that explicit when I come to talk with my group or talk to other people about my project. So I'm also kind of resisting some sort of reification or making something didactic, a little bit of that, but also just doing a kind of meaning making. So at one point in that clip where the rat says to his comrades, "I hate to be pragmatic," in this philosophical moment, I felt very suddenly directly addressed. And perhaps he's suggesting that we take some sort of positivist approach instead. No, I think that we should continue to be pragmatic. And when I say that, I'm talking about epistemology, and I'm talking about knowledge making or truth making. And I return to Haraway, and she says in Simian Cyborgs and Women, the examination of the debates about scientific objectivity in feminist theory argues for a transformation of the despised metaphors of organized and technological vision in order to foreground specific positioning, multiple mediation and partial perspective, and therefore possible allegory for feminist scientific and political knowledge. So for me, this meaning making, adding lots of threads, adding lots of input, I'm adopting that sort of approach when I'm making my poem. I'm also kind of doing a bit of automatic writing. I'm writing notes and getting inklings, and then I am sort of funneling those inklings into prose, also as a way of looking for clarity and trying to pin down this sort of tingly poetic feeling that I have when I watch a show like Beast Wars. So it's definitely a love letter to that as well. And it's really important for me that the technique, this process is playful, so connecting lots of disparate thoughts or systems and seeing how informations and ideas flow between. Haraway was asked in a recent interview what's so important about play, and she says play captures a lot of what goes on in the world. There is this kind of raw opportunism in biology and chemistry where things work stochastically to form emergent systematicities. It is not a matter of direct functionality. We need to develop practices for thinking about those forms of activity that are not caught by functionality, those which propose the possible but not yet, or those which are not yet but still open. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you online.